हेलो दोस्तों, बिगनर्स माइंड में आपका स्वागत है। और अभी हम कर रहे हैं यूनिट सेकंड, इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म सिंस 1991। अगर ये नहीं देखे हैं, पुरानी वीडियो नहीं देखी, तो प्लेलिस्ट बना रखी है, उसमें जाकर आप देख सकते हैं। ठीक है। उसमें 9th से लेकर 12th तक की इकोनॉमी कंप्लीट है, एनसीईआरटी। और इसके बाद हम करेंगे पॉलिटी। ठीक है। उसके बाद करेंगे हम हिस्ट्री। ऐसे ही चलते रहेगा, अलग अलग प्लेलिस्ट बनेंगी 9th से लेकर 12th। अब चलते हैं आगे। तो ये चैप्टर जो है किसके बारे में है? लिबरलाइजेशन, प्राइवेटाइजेशन एंड ग्लोबलाइजेशन एंड अप्रेजल। ये क्या सिखाएगा, सीख लेंगे जो भी सिखाएगा। देयर इज अ कंसेंसस। कंसेंसस मतलब कि आम सहमति। देयर इज अ कंसेंसस इन द वर्ल्ड टुडे दैट इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट इज नॉट ऑल एंड द जीडीपी इज नॉट नेसेसरली अ मेजर ऑफ प्रोग्रेस ऑफ अ सोसाइटी। ठीक है। अब आ जाते हैं इंट्रोडक्शन। यू हैव स्टडीड इन द प्रीवियस चैप्टर दैट सिंस इंडिपेंडेंस इंडिया फॉलोड द मिक्स्ड इकोनॉमी फ्रेमवर्क बाय कंबाइनिंग the advantages of the capitalist economic system with those of the socialist economic system. Some scholars argue that over the years, this policy resulted in the establishment of a variety of rules and laws which were aimed at controlling and regulating the economy, ended up instead in hampering the process of growth and development. Others state that India, which started its development path from near stagnation, has since been able to achieve growth in savings, develop a diversified industrial sector which produce a variety of goods and has experienced sustained expansion of agricultural output which has ensured food security. In 1991, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowing from abroad. Foreign exchange reserves, which we generally maintain to import petroleum and other important items, dropped to levels that were not sufficient for even a fortnight. The crisis was further compounded by rising prices of essential goods. All these led the government to introduce a new state of policy measures which change the direction of our developmental strategies. कुछ नई पॉलिसीज़ इंट्रोड्यूस करी थी हमने कब, 1991 में, जिससे कि हमारा जो इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर था, इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट था, उन वो एक तरीके से पूरी तरीके से चेंज हो गया। इन दिस चैप्टर we will look at the background of the crisis, measures that the government has adopted, and their impact on various sectors of the economy. Background क्या है? The origin of the financial crisis can be traced from the inefficient management of the Indian economy in the 1980. 1980 में जो हमारा inefficient यानी कि मैनेजमेंट जो था ठीक नहीं था, जिसकी वजह से क्राइसिस आया. We know that for implementing various policies and its general administration, the government generates funds from various sources such as taxation, running of public sector enterprises, etc. When expenditure is more than income, the government borrows to finance the deficit from banks and also from people within the country and from international financial institutions. When we import goods like petroleum, we pay in dollars which we earn from our exports. Development policies required that, even though the revenues were very low, the government had to overshoot its revenue to meet challenges like unemployment, poverty, and population explosion. The continued spending on development programs of the government did not generate additional revenue. Moreover, the government was not able to generate sufficiently from internal sources such as taxation when the government was spending a large share of its income on areas which do not provide immediate returns such as the social sector and defense. There was a need to utilize the rest of its revenue in a high efficient manner. The income from public sector undertakings was also not very high to meet the growing expenditure. At times, our foreign exchange, borrowed from other countries and international financial institutions, was spent on meeting consumption needs. Neither was an attempt made to reduce such profligate spending nor sufficient attention was given to boost exports to pay for the growing imports. In the late 1980s, government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by such large margins that meeting the expenditure through borrowings became unsustainable. Prices of many essential goods rose sharply. Imports grew at a very high rate without machine growth of exports. As pointed out earlier, foreign exchange reserves declined to a level that was not adequate to finance imports for more than 2 weeks. There was also not sufficient foreign exchange to pay the interest that needed to be paid to international lenders. Also, no country or international funders was willing to lend to India. India approached the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development (IBRD), popularly known as World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), and received $7 billion as a loan to manage the crisis. कितना लोन लिया था? $7 billion. ठीक है. For availing the loan, these international agencies expected India to liberalize and open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector, reduce the role of government in many areas, and remove trade restrictions between India and other countries. India agreed to the conditionalities of World Bank and IMF and announced the New Economic Policy (NEP). The NEP consisted of wide-ranging economic reforms. The thrust of the policies was towards creating a more competitive environment in the economy and removing the barriers to entry and growth of firms. जो बैरियर्स थे उन सबको हटा दिया था, उनकी एंट्री पर क्या कर दिया था, उनकी एंट्री को एक तरीके से आने दिया था, एंट्री हो गई थी बाहर से विदेशों की. This set of policies can broadly be classified into two groups: the stabilization measures and the structural reform measures. Stabilization measures are short-term measures intended to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments and to bring inflation under control. In simple words, this means that there was a need to maintain sufficient foreign exchange reserves and keep the rising prices under control. On the other hand, structural reforms policies are long-term measures aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing its international competitiveness by removing the rigidities in various segments of the Indian economy. The government initiated a variety of policies which fall under three heads: with liberalization, privatization, and ग्लोबलाई ग्लोबलाइजेशन. कौन कौन से हैं? एलपीजी, इसको बोलते हैं एलपीजी. क्या होता है ये? तीन रिफॉर्म्स 1991 में क्या हुआ था? इन रिफॉर्म को लागू किया गया था. लिबरलाइजेशन, as pointed out in the beginning, rules and laws which are aimed at regulating the economic activities became major hindrance in the growth and development. हिंड्रेंस का मतलब होता है बाधाएं होना. बाधाएं बढ़नी थी किस लिए? ग्रोथ और डेवलपमेंट में. लिबरलाइजेशन was introduced to put an end to these restrictions and open various sectors of the economy. Through a few liberalization measures were introduced in 1980s in area of industrial licensing, export-import policy, technology upgradation, fiscal policy, and foreign investment. Reform policies initiated in 1991 were more comprehensive. Let us study some important areas such as the industrial sector, financial sector, tax reforms, foreign exchange markets, and trade and investment sectors, which received greater attention in and after 1991. Deregulation of industrial sector. In India, regulatory machine mechanism were enforced in various ways. Industrial licensing, under which every entrepreneur had to get permission from government officials to start a firm, close a firm, or decide the amount of goods that could be produced. Second, private sector was not allowed in many industries. Some goods could be produced only in small scale industries, and control of prices fixation and distribution of selected industrial products. The reform policies introduced in and after 1991 removed many of these restrictions. Industrial licensing was abolished for almost all product categories: alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, and drugs and pharmaceuticals. The only industries which are now reserved for the public sector are a part of atomic energy generation and some core activities in railway transport. Many goods produced by small scale industries have now been reserved. In most industries, the market has been allowed to determine the prices. Financial sector reforms. Financial sector includes financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange operations, and foreign exchange market. The financial sector in India is regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. You may be aware that all banks and other financial institutions in India are regulated through various norms and regulations of the RBI. The RBI decides the amount of money that the banks can keep with themselves, fix interest rates, nature of lending to various sectors, etc. One of the major aims of financial sector reforms is to reduce the role of RBI from regulator to facilitator of financial sector. This means that the financial sector may be allowed to take decisions on many matters without consulting the RBI. The reform policies led to the establishment of private sector banks India as well as foreign. Foreign investment limit in bank was raised to around 74%. Those banks which fulfill certain conditions have been given freedom to set up new branches without the approval of RBI and rationalize their existing branch networks. Through bank have been given permission to generate resources from India and abroad. Certain managerial aspects have been retained with the RBI to safeguard the interests of the account holders and the nation. Foreign institutional investors (FII) such as merchant bankers, mutual funds and pension funds are now allowed to invest in Indian financial market. टैक्स रिफॉर्म्स ये पढ़ेंगे अब कल.